The sound of shattering ceramic didn't just echo through the hollow ribs of the Talladega warehouse. It sounded like a gunshot aimed directly at the heart of the great American boredom. Sterling Wainwright stood amidst a cloud of white dust, his tailored English flannel trousers already coated in a fine layer of pulverized clay. He didn't look at the mess. He looked at the woman leaning against the rusted corrugated metal door, her dark eyes tracking the drift of the dust motes in the humid Alabama heat. Sterling dropped the sledgehammer. It hit the concrete with a dull thud, punctuating the silence of 1958. "That," he said, his voice carrying the clipped, rhythmic precision of a man who had spent too much time in London and not enough time in the sun, "is the death of the mundane, Lola. Nobody wants a standard Sears and Roebuck sink anymore. They just don't know it yet." Eloisa Lola Moncada didn't move, but the corner of her mouth twitched. She flicked a stray ember from her cigarette, the smoke curling around her gold hoop earrings. She was a world away from the Havana social circles her father had once commanded, but she still carried the air of someone who owned the ground she stood on, even if that ground was a decaying shed in a town that smelled exclusively of pine sap and motor oil. "It's a bold statement, Sterling," she replied, her accent a smooth, rhythmic blend of Caribbean Spanish and expensive private schooling. "But you've just smashed $40 of perfectly functional inventory. In this county, $40 is a down payment on a tractor. You want to sell them status? These people still pray for rain to wash their faces." Sterling stepped over the shards of the white pedestal sink, the kind found in every cookie-cutter ranch house from Maine to Georgia. He reached into a wooden crate shipped from a small kiln outside of Naples, Italy. He pulled out a single tile, hand-painted in a deep Mediterranean cobalt with intricate gold leaf filigree along the edges. It caught the sliver of afternoon light cutting through the warehouse roof. "They pray for rain because they are bored, Lola. They buy tractors because they think they have to. But look at this. This isn't just a tile. It's a promise that they aren't just farmers in a dusty corner of the South. It's a connection to a world they've only seen in flickering newsreels." This was the birth of the porcelain conspiracy. Sterling Wainwright, the architect whose blueprints were too radical for the stiff-collared firms of Boston, had found his muse in the most unlikely of places: the bathroom. He saw the post-war boom not as a demand for houses, but as a desperate, unspoken hunger for identity. And Lola Moncada, with her father's secret ledger of shipping routes and her uncanny ability to charm the skin off a snake, was the only person who understood the logistics of desire. The financing of their first venture was as unconventional as their partnership. They didn't go to the Talladega National Bank. They knew the silver-haired men there would laugh them out of the lobby. Instead, Lola had spent the previous week in the back rooms of the local diners, talking to the wives of the wealthy cotton gin owners, women who were tired of looking at the same floral wallpaper and the same beige porcelain for 20 years. She didn't sell them a renovation. She sold them a subscription to elegance. "We aren't asking for a loan," Sterling explained, spreading a velvet cloth over a grease-stained workbench. He laid out 3 more tiles and a faucet handle carved from solid onyx, imported through a gray channel Lola had opened in New Orleans. "We are offering the Moncada Wainwright Syndicate. These families invest in our first shipment of Italian marble and French fixtures. In exchange, they get the first right of refusal for their own estates, and a percentage of the markup when we sell the rest to the new country club members in Birmingham." Lola watched him, realizing he wasn't just an artist. He was a magnificent fraudster of the highest order. He was using the social anxiety of the Southern elite to fund his own aesthetic revolution. She walked over to the workbench, her fingers grazing the cool, dark stone of the onyx handle. "And when the shipment gets misplaced or damaged, according to the manifests I've prepared?" she whispered, her eyes meeting his. Sterling smiled, a sharp, predatory expression that looked entirely out of place on his refined face. "Then the insurance pays for the expansion, and the recovered goods become exclusive, limited edition items with a 300% markup because of their rarity. It's the American way, isn't it?" Outside, the cicadas began their evening drone, a mechanical hum that seemed to vibrate through the very walls of the warehouse. For the first time in his life, Sterling Wainwright felt he was exactly where he needed to be. He wasn't building skyscrapers. He was building a dream out of the most private corners of the American home. He picked up a fragment of the smashed American sink and tossed it into the shadows. "Let the neighbors have their Sears catalogs," he said. "We're bringing Versailles to the valley." Lola stubbed out her cigarette and picked up the onyx handle, weighing it in her hand. "The first crate arrives Tuesday, Sterling. I've already told the sheriff's wife that it's coming from a palace in Madrid. She's already writing the check. Just make sure you don't break the expensive stuff." The dust settled, but the air remained electric. In the quiet of the Alabama twilight, the porcelain conspiracy had officially begun, funded by vanity, insured by deception, and destined to change the face of the South, one gilded faucet at a time. By the winter of 1959, the humidity of Alabama had been replaced by a biting, damp chill that rattled the window panes of the local manor houses. But inside the Wainwright Moncada headquarters, a refurbished carriage house on the edge of town, the atmosphere was feverish. The subscription to elegance had been more than a success. It had become a social contagion. However, the first hurdle of a growing empire is always the same: volume. Sterling could sell the dream, but Lola had to conjure the physical reality of it from a world still recovering from the scars of war and the complexities of international trade. "The Birmingham Port authorities are breathing down the neck of every freighter coming from the Mediterranean," Lola said, pinning a map of the Gulf Coast to the wall. She was wearing a sharp charcoal suit jacket, her hair pulled back in a severe professional bun that didn't quite hide the predatory glint in her eyes. "If we keep bringing the marble through the front door, the tariffs will eat our margins before the crates even hit the dirt. We need a side entrance." Sterling was hunched over a drafting table, sketching a bathroom layout for a prominent judge in Montgomery. The design featured a sunken tub surrounded by a mosaic of iridescent glass tiles. "The judge doesn't care about tariffs, Lola. He cares that his wife wants to feel like a Roman empress while she's bathing. But I agree. We need more than just crates. We need a fleet." This led to their first massive capital injection, a move that local historians would later call the ghost ship of Mobile. Lola utilized her father's old contacts, men who had once run rum and cigars through the Florida Keys and now operated small independent fishing fleets out of the Gulf. She convinced a group of these sailors to form a shell corporation, the Gulf Reclamation and Salvage Co. The pitch was brilliant in its simplicity. They weren't importing luxury goods. They were salvaging high-end construction materials from European vessels that had supposedly suffered cargo shifts in international waters. This allowed them to bypass the standard import duties and, more importantly, it allowed them to secure low-interest maritime development loans from the state, intended to bolster the local fishing industry. In November of 1959, a nondescript, rusted freighter named the Santa Clara limped into a private pier near Mobile. On paper, it was carrying industrial scrap. In reality, its hull was lined with 10 tons of Carrara marble, hand-carved mahogany vanities from a workshop in Seville, and thousands of delicate hand-blown glass sconces from Murano. Sterling met the ship at midnight. The air smelled of salt and diesel. As the cranes groaned, lifting the heavy wooden crates onto the back of their fleet of unmarked trucks, he felt the weight of the gamble. If the Coast Guard decides to check these manifests, we aren't just out of business, Lola. We're in a federal cell. Lola stood on the pier, handing a thick envelope of cash to the captain, a weathered man with a thick Galician accent. "The Coast Guard is looking for narcotics and Cuban dissidents, Sterling. They aren't looking for bathroom tiles. To them, this is just heavy stone." To ensure the hospitality of the local authorities, Lola had orchestrated a masterpiece of social engineering. She didn't bribe the officials with cash. She bribed them with demonstration models. By the time the Santa Clara docked, the mayor of Mobile had a new guest bathroom fitted with a bidet of such exquisite craftsmanship that it became the talk of his private circles. The chief of police had received a surplus shipment of Italian floor tiles for his patio. They hadn't just bought silence. They had turned the law into their most loyal customers. The financing for this specific shipment had come from a bridge loan, organized by a syndicate of local businesswomen, led by the indomitable Mrs. Gertrude Halloway. Gertrude was the unofficial queen of Talladega society, and she had seen in Sterling and Lola a way to bypass her husband's stingy grip on the family's cotton fortune. She and her circle had pooled their household allowances and charity funds, creating a shadow bank that funded the Santa Clara's voyage. "You see, Sterling," Lola remarked as the last truck pulled away from the pier, the headlights cutting through the coastal fog. "Men think money is something you find in a vault. But women know that money is just a form of permission. Gertrude didn't give us a loan. She gave us permission to change her world." By the time the sun rose over the Alabama pines, the salvaged luxury was being distributed to warehouses across 3 counties. The local newspapers began to carry small, intriguing advertisements for the Wainwright Collection, European History for the Modern Southern Home. There was no address listed, only a telephone number that rang in a quiet office where Lola sat, ready to turn curiosity into a contract. The porcelain conspiracy was no longer a secret project in a dusty shed. It was a well-oiled clandestine machine, turning the grit of the Gulf into the gold of the high society bathrooms. Sterling Wainwright had the vision, but Lola Moncada had provided the vessel. And as they drove back toward Talladega, the back of their car filled with blueprints and champagne, they knew they had crossed a line. They weren't just merchants anymore. They were architects of a new gilded reality. The headlines of desire and the gossip economy. By the spring of 1961, the Talladega Daily and the Birmingham Post-Herald had inadvertently become the primary marketing brochures for Wainwright and Moncada. Sterling didn't buy full-page advertisements. He understood that, in the South, a whispered rumor at a garden party carried more weight than 1,000 billboards. Instead, he cultivated news. The hook for their next phase was a carefully orchestrated media event. A headline appeared on the front page of the Talladega Daily on a Tuesday morning. "European mystery arrives in Alabama. Is the Holloway estate the new Versailles?" The article, written by a young journalist, whom Lola had treated to several expensive dinners, detailed the unprecedented arrival of architectural treasures at the home of Gertrude Holloway. It described marble so translucent it seemed to glow from within, and gold fixtures salvaged from a lost Mediterranean villa. Sterling sat in the town's most popular barber shop, hidden behind a copy of the very paper he had helped ghostwrite. He listened as the town's men, lawyers, farmers, and store owners, debated the sheer absurdity of a cotton family installing palace plumbing. "It's madness," one man muttered, his face lathered in shaving cream. "Why would Gertrude need a bidet? She's lived 50 years without one." "It's not about the bidet, Arthur," another replied, peering over his spectacles. "It's about the fact that she has one and your wife doesn't. My Martha hasn't stopped talking about that Italian mosaic since the Sunday social." That was the gossip economy at work. Sterling and Lola had turned envy into a financing tool. Every time a new article appeared, the demand spiked, allowing them to demand 50% deposits on future orders. This customer-funded model gave them a massive pool of interest-free capital. They weren't using bank loans. They were using the social competition of the Alabama elite to fund their inventory. However, the success brought its first real threat: the Standard American Company. They were the giants of the industry, and they didn't appreciate two boutique upstarts siphoning off their wealthiest clients in the region. A representative from the big city arrived in a sleek black Cadillac, smelling of cheap tobacco and corporate arrogance. He met Sterling in the carriage house, looking at the hand-painted tiles with visible disdain. "You're playing a dangerous game, Wainwright," the man said, flicking ash onto the pristine floor. "You're selling exotics without a license to distribute. We could shut you down with one phone call to the Trade Commission." Sterling didn't look up from his drafting board. He was meticulously detailing a fountain for a public square in Anniston, a project he was doing for free to cement his civic importance. "You could," Sterling said smoothly, "but then you'd have to explain to Mrs. Holloway and the mayor's wife why their limited edition master suites are now considered illegal contraband. I don't think you want to deal with the wrath of a Southern woman whose bathroom has been declared a crime scene." While Sterling handled the corporate threats, Lola was busy expanding the news cycle. She started a column in a regional lifestyle magazine under the pseudonym The Continental Eye. In it, she wrote about the shameful state of the American washroom and how true success is measured by the quality of one's private sanctuary. She wasn't just selling products. She was attacking the self-esteem of the middle class, making them feel that their standard, functional homes were suddenly obsolete. The financial masterstroke of 1961 came when Lola convinced the local newspaper owners to accept trade-in equity. In exchange for constant glowing coverage and society page features, Wainwright and Moncada would provide full renovations for the publishers' homes and offices. This ensured that the press was literally built out of their products. The newspapers weren't just reporting on the trend, they were living in it. By the end of the year, the porcelain conspiracy had reached a fever pitch. A local headline read, "The Golden Spigot: How Two Outsiders Turned Alabama into an Oasis of Style." The accompanying photo showed Sterling and Lola standing in front of their new warehouse, a massive whitewashed building that looked more like an art gallery than a plumbing supply store. They had successfully bypassed the traditional financial gatekeepers. They had no debt, a mountain of cash deposits, and a media machine that worked for them for free. But as Sterling looked at the mounting stack of orders from as far away as Atlanta and New Orleans, he realized that style was a fickle master. The higher they built this temple of porcelain, the harder people would try to tear it down. "The newspapers love us today, Lola," Sterling said, watching the sun set over the Talladega Square. "But a headline can change overnight. We need something more permanent than gossip." Lola joined him at the window, a glass of imported sherry in her hand. "Don't worry, Sterling. The beauty of status is that once people have it, they are terrified of losing it. We don't just own their bathrooms anymore. We own their reputations." The insurance gambit and the shattered shipment. By the autumn of 1962, the world was holding its breath as the Cuban Missile Crisis dominated the airwaves. In Talladega, however, Lola Moncada was dealing with a different kind of blockade. The ghost ship routes were becoming too perilous. The U.S. Navy was swarming the Florida Straits, and the informal salvage operations were under intense scrutiny. The business needed a massive infusion of liquidity to pivot toward domestic manufacturing, but the capital was tied up in a shipment of rare Portuguese azulejo tiles and onyx basins currently sitting in a customs-locked warehouse in New Orleans. "We can't wait for the bureaucrats to finish their coffee, Sterling," Lola said, pacing the length of their office, her heels clicking like a metronome on the Italian marble. "If we don't get that inventory out, we miss the deadline for the New Orleans Hotel Syndicate contract. That's a $100,000 forfeit." Sterling looked at the insurance policy spread across his desk. It was a complex, multi-layered document issued by a small Lloyd's of London affiliate that specialized in unusual maritime transit. A predatory light flickered in his eyes. "Lola, what is the exact definition of total loss in Section 4, Paragraph B?" Lola stopped pacing. She understood him instantly. The insurance gambit was born. They didn't just need the goods, they needed the insurance payout to fund the construction of their own kiln and foundry in Alabama. They needed to stop being importers and start being creators. But to do that, they needed their current inventory to disappear legally. Lola traveled to New Orleans under the guise of a social visit. There, she met with a terminal manager who had a penchant for high-stakes poker and a mountain of debt. A week later, a tragic accident occurred at the Pier 27 warehouse. A faulty crane cable, miraculously frayed at just the right point, snapped while hoisting a massive crate of their most expensive Portuguese tiles. The crate didn't just fall, it collided with the rest of the Wainwright and Moncada inventory, triggering a domino effect that sent 10 tons of porcelain and onyx crashing into the oily waters of the Mississippi River. The news hit the local papers with a dramatic flair. Tragedy at the docks, artistic treasures lost to the deep. To the public, it was a heartbreaking loss of culture. To the insurance adjusters, it looked like a clear-cut case of equipment failure. Sterling acted the part of the devastated artist perfectly, giving interviews about the irreplaceable loss of European heritage. Meanwhile, Lola was in the back rooms, meticulously documenting the total destruction for the claim. The genius of the gambit lay in the recovery. While the insurance company processed a massive payout for the destroyed goods, the New Orleans terminal manager ensured that several damaged crates were sold off as scrap for pennies on the dollar to a newly formed entity, the Talladega Reclamation Group. The entity was, of course, owned by Lola through a series of European shell companies. The shattered tiles weren't useless. Sterling spent nights in the warehouse, teaching a team of local craftsmen how to take the broken fragments and turn them into ancient mosaic collages. They rebranded the disaster as an artistic choice. They sold the recovered pieces at a premium, marketing them as the Phoenix Collection, artifacts that had survived a maritime catastrophe. By December, the insurance check arrived, a staggering sum that far exceeded the original cost of the goods. Combined with the revenue from the Phoenix Collection, Sterling and Lola suddenly found themselves sitting on a mountain of cash. "You're a monster, Sterling," Lola laughed as they sat in the quiet of their office, the fireplace crackling. "You turned a pile of rubble into a fortune and made the insurance company pay for the privilege of helping you sell it twice." "It's not a crime to find beauty in the broken, Lola," Sterling replied, raising a glass of bourbon. "It's just efficient financing." With the capital secured, they broke ground on their own factory. No longer would they be at the mercy of ships and storms. They were about to become the primary producers of elegance in the American South, and they had done it by turning a disaster into a masterpiece of financial engineering. The porcelain conspiracy had just upgraded from a trade route to an industry. The storm in Lincoln and the legal labyrinth. By early 1964, the porcelain conspiracy had outgrown the sleepy borders of Alabama. Sterling and Lola had moved their gaze northward, toward the growing suburbs of the Midwest, where new money was looking for a way to distinguish itself from the old. They had set their sights on a massive contract for the Lincoln State Plaza in Nebraska, a project that would solidify their brand as the national standard for luxury. However, the success of the Phoenix Collection and the insurance payout from New Orleans had left a paper trail that caught the eye of the Mid-Continental Trade Oversight, a regulatory body backed by the very corporate giants Sterling had insulted years prior. The hook came not with a hammer, but with a subpoena. A headline in the Lincoln Gazette read, "Luxury or Larceny? Talladega Tycoons under fire for unorthodox imports." "They aren't coming for our tiles, Sterling," Lola said, looking at the legal documents delivered to their new glass-walled office in downtown Lincoln. "They're coming for our history. They want to prove that the salvage in New Orleans was a premeditated act. If they link the Talladega Reclamation Group to our main accounts, we don't just lose the Nebraska contract. Mitterrand so." Sterling didn't panic. He understood that in the American legal system of the 1960s, truth was often a matter of architectural perspective. He hired Thaddeus Thorne, an attorney from a disgraced but brilliant lineage of New England lawyers, a man who viewed the law as a series of rooms to be redecorated. The financial struggle of Part 5 was the European bank shield. Sterling tapped into the remnants of his family's old connections in London and Zurich. He didn't just need a lawyer, he needed a quiet capital infusion to bury the investigation in a mountain of countersuits. He convinced a syndicate of European boutique investors, men who hated the American corporate monopolies, to provide a revolving credit line. This wasn't a loan. It was a cultural defense fund. The battle in the Lincoln courthouse became a spectacle. The prosecution argued that Wainwright and Moncada were common fraudsters. Thaddeus Thorne, coached by Sterling, argued that they were visionary conservationists. "My clients didn't destroy those goods," Thorne declared to a jury of Nebraskan farmers and tradesmen. "They rescued the soul of European craftsmanship from the bottom of a river where American negligence had dropped it." The insurance payout wasn't a profit. It was a reparation for the emotional labor of restoring beauty from the mud. While the lawyers argued, Lola moved behind the scenes of Lincoln's high society. She organized a secret auction of their most exclusive pieces, items that were not yet part of the public investigation, specifically for the wives of the state senators and the judges overseeing the Trade Commission. By the time the final hearing arrived, half the influential households in Lincoln had Wainwright marble in their master bathrooms. The storm in Lincoln ended not with a conviction, but with a strategic merger. The Oversight Committee, pressured by the very politicians whose homes had been beautified, agreed to drop the investigation if Wainwright and Moncada partnered with a local Nebraskan firm for the State Plaza project. "We lose 10% of the Nebraska profit," Sterling noted as they walked out of the courthouse into the crisp prairie air. "No, Sterling," Lola replied, a sharp smile on her face. "We didn't lose 10%. We just gained a Nebraskan subsidiary that can handle the northern logistics while we remain pure in the eyes of the South. We've turned a federal investigation into a taxpayer-funded expansion." The newspapers changed their tune within a week. Talladega duo vindicated, a new era of elegance for Lincoln. The legal storm had passed, but it had taught them a vital lesson. As they moved into the mid-60s, the conspiracy could no longer hide in the shadows of warehouses. They had to become the establishment itself to survive it. Green gold and the subterranean harvest. By 1965, the American landscape was shifting under the weight of the space age and the burgeoning fast food revolution. While the rest of the country looked to the stars, Sterling Wainwright and Lola Moncada looked beneath the soil of the Rust Belt. Their expansion into the north had revealed an unexpected opportunity. The vast abandoned limestone mines and salt caverns of Ohio and Pennsylvania. "The world is moving faster, Sterling," Lola said, pointing to a grainy photograph of a new drive-through restaurant in a Cleveland suburb. "People don't want to sit in a porcelain tub for an hour anymore. They want to eat in 5 minutes and look successful while doing it. The restaurants need an aesthetic, and they need it year-round." Sterling, ever the architect of atmosphere, saw a problem that traditional finance couldn't solve. The emerging fast food giants struggled with the seasonal costs of fresh produce, and their buildings were often drab, utilitarian boxes. His vision was to merge his high-end aesthetic with a radical new technology: industrial-scale hydroponics, housed in the constant temperature environments of abandoned mines. The hook for Part 6 was a headline that baffled the financial elites. "Talladega's porcelain kings buy worthless holes in the ground?" To the banks, it looked like madness. To Sterling and Lola, it was green gold. The financing for this venture, the Subterranean Syndicate, was their most complex yet. They didn't use cash. They used exchange equity. They convinced the owners of struggling steel mills and mining companies to trade their land for design bonds. These bonds promised the owners a stake in the future Wainwright-Moncada corporate parks that would eventually be built on top of the mines. Essentially, they were buying real estate with promises of future beauty. Inside the mines, Sterling designed a cathedral of agriculture. He replaced the dark, damp tunnels with rows of glowing, purple-lit hydroponic trays, framed by his signature polished marble and ornate tile work. It was a fusion of a high-end spa and a high-tech farm. "If we are going to grow lettuce for the masses, Lola," Sterling remarked, adjusting the valves on a brass irrigation system he had designed to look like a French fountain, "it shall be grown in a palace. The atmosphere affects the flavor of the investment." The green gold strategy paid off when they secured an exclusive contract with a burgeoning burger franchise. The deal was simple. Wainwright and Moncada would provide the interior design for every new location, using their excess inventory of tiles, and in exchange, they would be the sole suppliers of palace-grown greens and tomatoes, grown in the Ohio caverns. This wasn't just about food, it was about visual vertical integration. They owned the plates, the walls the plates sat near, and the food on the plates. The news from the financial papers was ecstatic. Wainwright and Moncada invent the total environment contract. By the end of 1965, they had successfully diversified their empire. They were no longer just the bathroom people. They were the architects of the American sensory experience. However, this new venture brought them into contact with a different kind of power. The national grocery cartels and the agricultural unions didn't take kindly to interior decorators disrupting the supply chain. "They're calling it unfair aesthetic advantage in the trade papers," Lola said, showing Sterling a clipping from a Chicago journal. "They can't beat our prices, so they're attacking our artificial methods." Sterling merely smiled, running his hand over a cold marble pillar in the heart of an Ohio mine. "Let them call it artificial, Lola. By the time they finish their protests, every suburban family in the Midwest will believe that a salad isn't a salad unless it comes from a marble cavern." The porcelain conspiracy had gone underground, and in the darkness it was blooming into a billion-dollar reality. They had turned abandoned holes in the earth into a high-yield, high-design laboratory for the future of American consumption. The expansion in the lavender sky. By 1967, the American social fabric was fraying at the edges, colored by the psychedelic hues of the Summer of Love and the rising volume of anti-war protests. Sterling Wainwright and Lola Moncada, however, were obsessed with a different kind of revolution: the suburban siege. They had conquered the bathrooms of the South and the stomachs of the Midwest. Now they aimed for the very horizon. "The ground is too crowded, Sterling," Lola said, looking out from their new penthouse office in Atlanta. She was wearing a bold lavender silk suit that matched the twilight sky over the city. Every developer in Georgia is building a strip mall. If we want to stay ahead, we have to own the air they breathe. The hook for Part 7 was an audacious financial maneuver that the press dubbed the invisible land grab. Sterling and Lola began purchasing air rights, the legal right to the space above existing buildings and transit hubs in rapidly growing small cities like Charlotte, Greenville, and Huntsville. To the traditional bankers, these were ghost assets, intangible and worthless. But to Sterling, they were the canvas for the next decade of American advertising and communication. The financing for the Lavender Sky project came from their most daring source yet, the Aesthetic Annuity Fund. They convinced a group of pension fund managers, men looking for stable, long-term investments in a volatile market, to buy into a beautification bond. The pitch was that by controlling the air rights, Wainwright and Moncada would replace the visual pollution of chaotic billboards with a curated artistic landscape of neon, porcelain, and light, charging premium rents for prestigious visibility. "We aren't just selling space," Sterling explained to a skeptical board of trustees in North Carolina. "We are selling the skyline. Every citizen who looks up will see a world designed by us. We are turning the atmosphere into a blue-chip asset." To secure the first major air rights corridor in Charlotte, they had to move fast. Lola deployed her Interior Swallows, a team of elegant, highly trained female agents who didn't sell tiles, but rather lifestyle consultations. These women worked their way into the city planning commissions, subtly convincing the wives of the commissioners that a city with a Wainwright-curated skyline would see property values triple. The expansion was not without its risks. The traditional outdoor advertising syndicate, a group of old-school billboard moguls with ties to organized labor, saw this as an act of war. They didn't like the idea of fine art taking over their lucrative plywood territory. In August of 1967, a headline in the Charlotte Observer read, "War for the Clouds. Local moguls challenge Wainwright's air empire." There were reports of mysterious fires at their warehouse sites and legal injunctions that threatened to ground their neon installations. Sterling responded with a masterpiece of visual defiance. Instead of fighting in the courts, he organized a one-night light manifesto. He used his connections in the electronics industry, funded by the green gold profits from the mines, to synchronize a massive light show across the air rights they already owned. For 10 minutes, the Charlotte skyline was bathed in a carefully choreographed display of lavender and gold, projected onto the side of buildings and through high-powered searchlights. The public was enchanted. The newspapers the next day didn't talk about legal disputes. They talked about the night the city glowed. "They can't sue a miracle, Lola," Sterling said, watching the morning sun hit the very air they now legally controlled. But the risk was mounting. They had borrowed heavily against their future sky rents, and the aesthetic annuity had a clause. If the project didn't reach full profitability by 1970, the pension funds could seize their domestic factories. They were flying high, but the higher they flew, the thinner the air became. The porcelain conspiracy was now a skyline syndicate, and the stakes were as high as the lavender heavens themselves. The decade in ink and the paper empire. As 1968 bled into 1969, the porcelain conspiracy became more than a business. It became a cultural phenomenon documented in 1,000 headlines. The world was spinning faster: the moon landing, the escalation of the Vietnam War, and the rise of the counterculture. But Sterling and Lola had built a paper empire that seemed to exist in its own stratosphere of success. The hook for Part 8 was the sudden, overwhelming ubiquity of their names. In January of 1968, the Wall Street Journal ran a feature that changed everything. The Alchemy of Aesthetics: How Wainwright and Moncada Turned Luxury into a Commodity. For the first time, the quiet capital of their European backers was being scrutinized by the heavyweights of New York. The financial strategy of this period was the information arbitrage. Sterling and Lola realized that their greatest asset wasn't the marble or the air rights. It was the narrative of their success. They began to buy up small, failing local newspapers across the South and the Midwest, not to run them as news outlets, but to use them as local validation engines. Whenever they planned an expansion into a new town, their own newspapers would begin a 6-month campaign of style education. They didn't sell products. They sold the idea that the town was behind the times. A typical headline in the Huntsville Herald, now secretly under their control, would read, "Is Huntsville ready for the 70s? Local architecture lagging behind European standards." 3 weeks later, a Wainwright Moncada design center would conveniently open on Main Street. They were manufacturing the problem and then selling the expensive, tiled solution. The financing for this media takeover was genius. They used barter credits. They offered the struggling newspaper owners a deal. Wainwright and Moncada would renovate the publisher's offices and printing plants into modernist icons, and in exchange, they received 51% of the voting stock in the media companies. They were literally buying the press with the same marble they had once salvaged from the Mississippi. However, the paper empire began to show cracks when a rogue investigative journalist in Chicago, Silas Thorne, no relation to their lawyer, Thaddeus, published a scathing expose in an underground magazine. The headline was brutal: "The Gilded Trap, the Hidden Debt and Dark Origins of the Porcelain Kings." Thorne had found the paper trail to the New Orleans insurance claim and the ghost ships of Mobile. He didn't have proof yet, but he had the scent. "He's digging into the Phoenix collection, Sterling," Lola said, throwing the magazine onto a mahogany desk. "He's calling our art fraudulent wreckage. If the SEC reads this and starts matching the manifest from '59 with our current inventory, the aesthetic annuity will collapse." Sterling didn't blink. He was looking at a prototype for a new line of acrylic ceramic fusion tiles, the first step toward the synthetic materials of the 1970s. "Silas Thorne is an idealist, Lola. And idealists always make the same mistake. They think people care more about the truth than they do about their own status. We don't fight him with facts. We fight him with a bigger headline." Within a week, the Wainwright-controlled newspapers across 3 states ran a synchronized story. "The future is synthetic." Wainwright and Moncada launched the Lunar Collection in honor of Apollo 11. They completely ignored the allegations and instead pivoted the public's attention to the moon. They marketed their new, cheaper-to-produce acrylic tiles as space-age tech, charging 5 times the production cost. The surge in Lunar Collection pre-orders provided enough cash to buy out Silas Thorne's publisher and turn the underground magazine into a high-end interior design journal. The investigation was buried under a mountain of glossy photos of celebrity bathrooms. By the end of 1969, they had effectively privatized the news in their key markets. They were the architects, the suppliers, the landlords of the air, and now the authors of the truth. But as the decade turned, the porcelain conspiracy was no longer a secret between 2 partners. It was a massive, fragile web of debt and perception, held together by the ink on a page and the vanity of a nation. The last bet and the digital dawn. The 1970s arrived with the screech of an oil embargo and the cold realization that the infinite growth of the 60s was a fever dream. The American economy was stuttering into stagflation. For Wainwright and Moncada, the lavender sky was no longer a symbol of limitless ambition. It was a liability. The aesthetic annuity bonds were coming due, and the high interest rates were threatening to turn their paper empire into a pyre. "The marble is too heavy, Sterling," Lola said, standing in their Chicago data center, a stark, windowless room filled with the hum of the first mainframe computers they had financed. "People are cutting budgets. They aren't buying hand-carved Italian pedestals anymore. They're buying plastic. They're buying efficiency." The hook for Part 9 was the most radical pivot in the history of the conspiracy. A headline in the Chicago Tribune sent shockwaves through the industry. "Design giants abandon the kiln. Wainwright and Moncada bet the future on the logic of living." Sterling hadn't just bought computers. He had used the last of their green gold reserves to finance the development of an early algorithmic logistics system. He called it the aesthetic matrix. The goal was to automate the entire interior design process, predicting consumer trends and optimizing the manufacturing of synthetic materials to match the declining purchasing power of the middle class. The financing for this last bet was a move of pure desperation. They securitized their remaining air rights, not as advertising space, but as a future network for microwave data transmission. They sold the potential of the air to a consortium of early telecommunications pioneers. This provided a massive one-time cash infusion, but it meant they were effectively selling the sky they had fought so hard to own. "We are trading the view for the signal, Lola." Sterling remarked, watching a technician feed punch cards into the IBM system. The 70s won't be about how a room looks. It will be about how information flows through it. The risk was total. If the aesthetic matrix failed to correctly predict the shift toward ecological minimalism, they would be left with a warehouse full of synthetic junk and a mountain of debt to the telecom consortium. In early 1971, the porcelain conspiracy faced its greatest internal crisis. The interior swallows, the elite sales force Lola had built, began to defect. They didn't want to sell optimized logistics and synthetic surfaces. They were artists, and they felt betrayed by Sterling's move toward cold, computer-driven design. The Great Defection, Wainwright's Sales Queens Strike Over Plastic Future, read a headline in a prominent design journal. The rebellion threatened to halt their distribution just as the new synthetic Lunar 2.0 line was launching. Lola handled the crisis with her trademark ruthless elegance. She didn't fight the defection, she weaponized it. She offered the striking agents a buyout option, allowing them to take the remaining inventory of authentic Italian marble and Portuguese tiles and start their own boutique firms, under the condition that they use the Wainwright aesthetic matrix for all their logistical needs. She turned her competitors into her customers. "They get the art, Sterling," Lola said, closing the ledger on the deal. "But we get the data. Every time they sell a unique marble sink, our computers learn exactly who is still buying luxury and why. We've turned our sales team into a research department." By the end of 1971, the gamble seemed to be paying off. While other luxury firms were filing for bankruptcy, Wainwright and Moncada were leaner and more technologically advanced than any corporation in the Midwest. They had survived the end of the post-war boom by being the first to realize that the American dream was being recalculated by a machine. However, the last bet had a hidden cost. Sterling Wainwright, the man who had once smashed a sink to prove a point about beauty, was now obsessed with the green glow of the computer monitors. He was no longer designing bathrooms. He was designing systems. The conspiracy was no longer about a shared vision of elegance. It was a cold, digital calculation of survival, and the legacy of the Spectrum and the final auction. By the summer of 1972, the air in America felt heavy, saturated with the tension of the Watergate scandal and the slow withdrawal from a long, weary war. In a high-rise office in Chicago, Sterling Wainwright and Lola Moncada stood before a wall of windows, looking out at a city that was becoming a grid of glass and steel, a far cry from the dusty Alabama warehouse where they had first smashed a porcelain sink. The hook for the finale came not from a headline of scandal, but from a headline of total conquest. The Wall Street Journal's front page on July 14, 1972 read, "The Invisible Exit: Why the Porcelain Kings Are Selling Their Throne." The porcelain conspiracy had reached its logical conclusion. They had transformed from importers to manufacturers, from aesthetic rebels to digital logisticians. They didn't just own the market. They had become the market's infrastructure. But as the aesthetic matrix began to predict a decade of beige austerity and mass-produced uniformity, Sterling and Lola realized that the thrill of the gamble was over. The rebellion had become the establishment. The final financial maneuver, the legacy liquidation, was a masterpiece of exit strategy. They didn't sell their company to a competitor. They sold it to the Mid-Continental Urban Development Trust, a massive government-backed conglomerate. By doing so, they ensured that their synthetic patents and aesthetic matrix software would be integrated into the very fabric of public housing and urban renewal projects across the country. "We are selling the ghost, Sterling," Lola said, watching the couriers move the last of their leather-bound ledgers. "The government doesn't want our style. They want our efficiency. They want to know how to house 10,000 people, with the same amount of tile we used to put in a single Holloway bathroom." The final auction of their private collection took place in October. It was the most exclusive event in the history of the South and the Midwest. The unfortunate New Orleans shipment, the recovered Mediterranean marble, and the original hand-painted prototypes were all under the hammer. The news from the Talladega Daily, the paper where it all began, carried a tone of bittersweet nostalgia. The end of the Gilded Era, Wainwright and Moncada bid farewell to the valley. The auction raised a sum that allowed Sterling and Lola to settle every aesthetic annuity, pay off the telecom consortium, and still leave them with a fortune that was untraceable and immense. On their final evening in Alabama, they returned to the old warehouse. It was empty now, the corrugated metal doors groaning in the wind. Sterling found a single shard of cobalt blue tile tucked in a corner, a fragment of the original Portuguese azulejo. "Was it ever about the porcelain, Sterling?" Lola asked, her voice softened by the twilight. She wasn't wearing her sharp business suits anymore. She was dressed for travel, a silk scarf fluttering around her neck. Sterling looked at the shard, then out at the town square where their first fountain still stood, its water shimmering under the new mercury vapor streetlights they had lobbied for. "No, Lola. It was about proving that in a country obsessed with the future, you can fund a revolution with the past. We didn't just sell sinks. We sold the idea that life could be a work of art, even if the foundation was made of broken glass and insurance claims." They walked out of the warehouse for the last time. There were no cameras, no journalists, and no subpoenas. They had successfully navigated 20 years of financial tightropes, legal storms, and cultural shifts. They had changed the aesthetic of the American home, moving it from the mundane to the magnificent, and finally to the efficient. As their car pulled away toward the airport, headed for a quiet retirement in the Mediterranean, the source of their original conspiracy, the radio played a soft tune about the changing times. The porcelain conspiracy was over, but its legacy remained in the iridescent tiles of 1,000 bathrooms, the neon glow of the city skylines, and the secret code of an algorithm that would dictate American taste for the next 30 years. The architects of desire had left the building, and for the first time in 2 decades, the headlines were someone else's problem.